Well, hello there, and welcome to another version of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We are doing the international version of Warbird Wednesday. Yes, international. I am actually standing in front of the Supermarine Spitfire, which we're going to cover that aircraft today. First of all, I want to say hello to the Queen, and we have one of your armaments behind me. So greetings to the Queen. We have spared no expense today because I have actually brought in an English person to translate for me for some of this because of my slightly Texas accent that I use that obviously does not do proper homage to the Queen's English. So without further ado, I am going to, by the way, I'm supposed to be one of the Queen's guards, but I'm not really sure I'm pulling this whole thing off. My assistant today is the Randy, Greg Kenny, using a term. He is Randy today. So I am going to remove this. Greg, I'm going to have to start getting medical coverage for this, I think. This thing actually kind of, by the way, you notice where my pencil came out of. It was in my hat. Now we know what those English guards do. They keep their lunch in there, you know. So I'm going to take this and toss it off screen. Another perfect catch by the Randy cameraman, Greg Kenny. And so we're talking today about probably one of the aircraft that, if you were going to say, is a national symbol. The Mustang could be for the United States for World War II, but if you look at the aircraft here, this Spitfire, this plane is probably more embedded in the British and the English society than anything else, and an iconic weapon from World War II. Originally designed in 1936 and flown, and then entering service in 1938, it was a huge leap forward. And what I mean by that is that the British at that time were really on the cutting edge of technology and aviation technology. And this aircraft, there were hurricanes. I have my translator, my English translator off camera, who is literally falling on the floor as I am butchering all these proper English words. It's normally the hurricane or whatever they call it. But the hurricane was there, and then you had a bunch of biplane fighters prior to that. The British were moving forward. What they were up against in Europe was a rapidly rearming Germany. And Germany and Japan, we've talked about this in other episodes, knew they were going to go to war. They knew it a long time before the Allies really figured it out, and they were testing weapons systems at that time to bring them into a much larger conflict. And so the Spitfire was on par with some of the German airplanes, but the Germans had been fielding, especially in the Spanish Civil War, a number of designs that they were testing in combat in that kind of low-intensity civil war in Spain, and they were testing those airplanes in combat, just as the Japanese were testing a lot of their types and their weapons in China. Both countries were kind of perfecting their weapons because they knew they were going to get drawn into a larger conflict. So what we're going to do now is we are going to bring in my English interpreter who has been schooling me in the proper English etiquette. There are many things about the English that I never understood. My fries, my French fries, Randy Gregg, are now chips. And I never knew I had a garden. I have a garden, which is my backyard. But those are cool things because now I can go and eat my chips in the backyard, in my garden, Greg, which is really nice. You could do that too. You could go out into your Randy Gregg garden and do whatever you'd like to do. He's contemplating that. I can actually see him rolling his eyes. So if we could bring in my English interpreter, Chris, come on over here. Come on over here. You can actually, we spare no expense for this. So maybe this is Chris. Can you confirm that you truly are an English person?
I am an Englishman.
There you go. This is what an Englishman looks like. We have spared no expense. For full disclosure, by the way, he is masked up. We are social distance, but for the show, I have to be without a mask. But he's got his mask on. Wear your mask, wash your hands, and do social distancing. But he is a proper Englishman, and for full disclosure, he is my son-in-law. So he has been teaching me in the ways of the English. Is that true?
Yes, sir.
There we go. See, he also speaks on command, which is very nice. So perhaps you could give me the proper enunciation of the term Spitfire.
Spitfire.
So you'll notice it's not Spitfire, it's more like Spitfire. Fire. I can't even. Fire. Fire. Is that close?
No.
I didn't think so. Okay, well, what we would do now is we have for those of you at home, you have the proper enunciation of Spitfire in the English language, which you speak properly, correct?
Yes, sir.
There you go. He's also quite brief. Now, if you are interested in this airplane behind me, we are going to do the gratuitous product placement ahead here because we're going to let Chris go about his day. So if Chris could turn around, you will notice we have this beautiful Spitfire shirt. You could own this. You could be a proper English gentleman by owning this shirt. Go out to the website and pick it up. You will notice he is the perfect model for this shirt, and we want to thank him for doing that. So Chris, we appreciate that. Thank you very much, and go about your day. And we're going to get back to this. Now, one thing you did, there you go, he does that. I was going to say one thing that you can find English people is you have to do this. Spitfire. There you go. I don't know if you picked that up, but if you want to find an Englishman anywhere in a building, just scream Spitfire, and they are genetically compelled to respond. I don't understand why. Maybe one of you can help me with it. So we're going to get back to the airplane now, and I'm going to take my Spitfire model and cover kind of the key design points. First of all, we'll give you a plan view. One of the key things about the Spitfire was this elliptical wing. Mitchell, when he designed this airplane, this wing, designed by the way, is one of the best designs to get lift. I'm going to give you some of the challenges with it, but it actually is a very nice wing shape when we talk about things that are going to generate lift as the airplane goes through the air. There is a challenge with it, Greg. Did you know what that challenge is? Did you know, Greg? The challenge is that the wing shape is very efficient, but it also is subject to stall, to losing lift more than any other wing. So what they would do with this is the Spitfire designers actually gave it a little bit of a twist and a tapering in the wing in various areas, and what that would do is that would cause, and this is for the young man that is at home, I want you to go look this up, okay, who follows my show. This would cause, when they give it a twist and they give it a little bit of a tapering, that would cause what's called, Greg, washout. And washout would mean that instead of the entire wing stalling, only certain portions of the wing would stall. I want you to go out and look that up. Now, Greg, Fred, fun fact, I think this is the first one in this video. Do you know what other aircraft had an elliptical wing? There were a couple of them, Greg. Do you know? P-47, the P-47. So, Greg, the other airplane that had this elliptical wing was the Val dive bomber. So it was a very, very efficient shape. The early versions of this airplane had a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in it. Later versions had a Griffin engine, which is a more powerful engine we're going to talk about. These aircraft had 303 machine guns in it, primarily the early versions. Later they had 50 caliber machine guns. They also had 20 millimeter cannons, although the early versions of the 20 millimeter cannon in this airplane, the British had a lot of trouble with that cannon, and it wasn't until later models like this aircraft that we have here that had a mix of cannons and machine guns, either 50 calibers or 303s. You can also tell one of the interesting cooling things about this airplane is that you could see right here, that's the one of the cooling intakes on this airplane. The Griffin aircraft had 2 cooling intakes, and Greg can get a pickup shot of that, but that's a dead giveaway. That's a later Mark, like the Mark 14, which had which needed that larger cooling. Now, the undercarriage on this airplane, this is the landing gear, had similar characteristics to the ME-109 in that very narrow gear. So the aircraft was actually subject to ground loop. In other words, you could get this airplane to go over on its side fairly easily, or dump the airplane, put the airplane into the prop. The British were taking off of a lot of, especially during the Battle of Britain, they were taking off unimproved grass fields. They flew off grass fields. So a little bit more forgiving than pavement or revetments, which is steel grate. But if you nose the airplane in, you have a problem. Now, another Fred fun fact, Randy Gregg. Did you know we have another Fred fun fact? What were these propellers made out of? A lot of these propellers. They were wood. And why were they wood? They were wood because if you dump the airplane into the ground, you break the propeller and you don't necessarily tear the transfer case and all that stuff up in the prop. Even this prop behind me, this 5-bladed Rotal prop, which is also a dead giveaway of the Mark 14 Spitfire, later versions, has a wood prop, if you can believe that, Greg. That's kind of cool. So this aircraft, there were 20,000 of these made in all types, and they were up in service, like this airplane was up in service up until the late 50s. I think this airplane was actually retired in 1957. Now, let's talk about a little bit. I'm going to put this down right here. Let's talk about what they were up against. So the British, when they were in Europe and the war started, and the Germans actually invaded the Low Countries and attacked France a little bit later, the British did try to provide fighter cover for the Allied armies that were in Western Europe. The challenge for them is they were up against a very well-organized and well-targeted Luftwaffe. Now, the Luftwaffe, you have to remember, at that time, and pretty much for the entire war, I'm going to move over here, Greg, was designed to be forward aerial artillery. So in Blitzkrieg, the idea behind the German Blitzkrieg, very top level, is the Germans would blow a hole in their adversary's defensive line, and then they would pour into the rear areas. And the idea was, but you get behind the defending armies, you'd cut off their supply chain, and the rest is history. And that's really what happened in Western Europe. They completely outflanked the French and the Maginot Line, and the war was over at that point in France. It was just a matter of time. The Germans had equipment and personnel that could move very quickly, and so they were able to overwhelm the French ultimately in the Battle of France. But the British were having a problem in that they were trying to provide fighter cover, and what they were up against was ME-109s, and we talked about the common design issue with the German and the British fighters, the Spitfire, was that you see very narrow undercarriage. This particular aircraft is in more traditional German markings. We've talked about yellow noses before, and in the Battle of France, this yellow nose undercarriage was actually as an identifier so that they didn't get shot at by ground fire. But later in the war, these yellow noses were the sign of a section leader or squadron leader or somebody important in the German Air Force. So ME-109, primarily the adversary that they had in the ME-109 at that time, and we've covered the 109, so I'm not going to go deep into it, was the ME-109E. We'll talk about some of those drawbacks here in a minute. And then a very capable fighter, this is the Focke-Wulf, the FW-190, another very, very capable fighter. Now you'll notice this, as opposed to the ME-109, that is a 12-cylinder engine, similar to what the Spitfire has it. This, and we talked a lot about this, I'm not going to spend any time on it, but this is a radial engine fighter, very intricate cowling design. The Focke-Wulf, the FW-190, was incredibly capable, and probably, and some people can argue with me, but as far as piston engine fighters, was probably the best fighter the Germans ever produced. They couldn't really stick with one thing. They produced a lot of different types as they were chasing weapons and air superiority, but the this was probably the best fighter they produced. And then the Germans, as they were in the Battle of France and later the Battle of Britain, the Ju-88s, on the table here is a very nice diorama that you could see when you come to the museum that has Ju-88s, but it has a couple of other interesting aircraft in it, in that it has the Henkel, the HE-111, which was the primary German medium bombardment airplane that they dropped bombs with, and then the Me-110. Now, the interesting thing about the Me-110, the Me-110 was called the Destroyer. That was the nickname for it. It was a heavy fighter at the outset of the war. The Spitfire and the more nimble single-engine fighters were more than a match, and it proved that it could not really defend itself in a very high threat environment with other British or Allied fighters. It did come into its own as a night fighter. It could carry radar later in the war, and especially against the British bomber streams at night, it was extremely good. So you've got all that stuff in there, but the German doctrine and philosophy was support the ground troops, and we're right on the airport. There's one of those jet guys. I'll wave hi to him. The German doctrine at the time was close air support, what we call COIN today, close air support, stay close to the front lines, and help those ground troops. They were not as focused in strategic bombing, and by the way, that would come back and bite them hard when they were fighting in the Battle of Britain, where the Spitfire really came into its own. So that was kind of the stage being set with the Spitfire. Now, the Spitfire was not as numerous initially as the Hurricane was. A Hurricane, I'm using Hurricane. There's my Spitfire. There you go. I found him. He's over there somewhere. Was not as numerous as the Spitfire, but the Spitfire had a much better kill ratio and loss ratio than the Hurricane, and was at the end of the day a superior fighter, or at least on par with an average pilot to what the Germans types. So historically, what ended up happening was the Germans overwhelmed the French. We know what happened. They won the Battle of France, and then the stage was set for the Battle of Britain. Now, Hitler knew he had to cross the channel to attack the British, and the German doctrine that had worked for them really well was, and it really stands up to today. I mean, the first rule is get air superiority, right? Because you get air superiority, and your opponent at that point can't move men and material on the battlefield without being attacked from the air. That is what set the stage for the Battle of Britain with the Germans and the British. Now, the Germans underestimated a couple of things. The first thing was radar. They did not anticipate how effective the British were in air defense, and this would play a bigger role even for the Germans in American strategic bombardment and in British night attacks later in the war. And the Germans completely underestimated the ability of the British to be able to vector in their fighters to these German bomber streams as they were coming in. The Germans initially used Stuka dive bombers, which we've talked a little bit about, to try to interdict shipping in the channel, and then they started attacking both the British air bases and the British radar defense. They started to try to eliminate radar. What ended up happening with that was Spitfire proved to be more than a match for the Stukas, which had primarily been having their way in the Battle of France unescorted. The Spitfires and the Hurricanes really took them out and made the Stuka no longer a factor. And then you had the Me-110s that did not fare well. The Ju-88s actually were that was a very fast airplane. And Ju-88 pilots were actually able to, in many times, get away from Spitfires. The Henkel, not so much, the Henkel 111. But so when the Battle of Britain started, the British were able to start to mount a vigorous air defense. Now, they had a couple of things working against them. One thing was they were caught flat-footed on production. You have to build these airplanes, and they were way behind the power curve in building enough Spitfires. The other problem was trained pilots. They did not have enough trained pilots because they had actually suffered losses in the Battle of France, which they had a hard time replacing. And then remember, even in this flipped on the axis later in the war with attrition. When you lose large groups of trained pilots, you just don't put more pilots into the field that quickly. And the British were really struggling with that. As a consequence, in the Battle of Britain, you had Czechs, Poles, Americans, Canadians, South Africans, all flying for the Royal Air Force, the RAF, in the Battle of Britain, fighting against the Germans. Now, the other thing was, first of all, as I said, this is a superior airplane. The other challenge was in the Battle of Britain that although the bombers had enough fuel to stay over the target, and I'm going to talk about another mistake the Germans made early on in the Battle of Britain, the Me-109s, the fighters only had, depending on their combat throttle settings, only had about 20 minutes TOT, time over target. So guess what? You go to military power, you've got these bomber streams lumbering in there, whatever they're going after. Your fighter escort can only stay with them for so long. The other thing was, what happens with that RAF pilot? Let's say the Spitfire or the Hurricane gets hit. What happens? That pilot bails out over Greg. Greg, what is he? Fred, fun fact, what does he bail out of? He bails out of over friendly territory. He loses the airplane and he fights another day. Those German pilots are either crashing or ending up in hostile territory, and they're not getting out of there. They're across the channel. They're not coming back. And that happened a lot. So you'd have British pilots that would have an airplane shot out from under them, and then they just bail out and go get another one. And that would flip to the other side when the Germans were defending against these big bomber streams, the same challenge. They would get shot down over friendly territory. They go back and get another airplane. But in the Battle of Britain, all of those things ended up working against the Germans. Now, Göring had told Hitler that he was going to be able to get air superiority, that he wouldn't have any trouble because he basically rolled over everybody else. At that point, the Germans were believing their own press, very similar to what was happening with the Japanese. They really did feel they were invincible, and they started ignoring all these basic principles of combat. Ultimately, it didn't matter what their air superiority was, and superiority in numbers. They ended up simply losing combat initiative on the basis of tactics. They just did not employ their resources in the right way, and ultimately, the British were able to prevail in the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain's been covered 100 times, a million times, so I'm not going to cover that too much, but that is kind of an overview. Now, that's where the Spitfire worked its way in to the British and the English psyche as an iconic weapon in the resistance in World War II. But the Spitfire, Greg, what did it do? It just went on. It kept going, and they kept putting out more marks. Now, the thing that they were doing, and this is consistent with all of the other Allied fighters that we have reviewed, whether it's the P-51 or the Wildcat to the Hellcat to the Tiger Cat, the Allies kept evolving these types. These aircraft continue to evolve. This is an evolution of an aircraft behind me from the early Spitfires, in that this has a Griffin engine in it, which is the largest V-12 that the British produced. It was in some transport airplanes. They also put it in to their fighters. Now, interestingly enough, it was a little bit bigger on displacement, and you aficionados who are engine guys can figure out what the exact dimensions of the airplane, the engine were in the airplane. But the most important thing is it produced about 35% more power. So what does that mean, Greg? Fred, fun fact, what do you do when you put more power, especially in a piston engine airplane? You've got this big paddle spinning on the front of the airplane. What happens? What happens, Greg? Torque. What is torque? You know, we've talked about before. You get that drill, and you got that screw on the end of that piece of wood, and you torque it in, or you push it hard, and the wood wants to spin out there as you're trying to put the screw in. No different with these airplanes. you add more power, you create more torque depending on which way the propeller is rotating, and the airplane wants to spin or turn with the aircraft with that torque. So Spitfires were in the speed range of about 370 miles an hour up to about 400 miles an hour. Some of them did have either single or twin turbochargers. We've talked about turbochargers, which basically compress the air and put more air and fuel into the motor, and that maintains your horsepower as you get up into thinner air at high altitude, but at different altitudes. This airplane was no different. I want you to go out and read about pilots who flew these Griffin engine Spitfires. What was different? Well, the stance of the airplane and that kind of tapered nose dropped away. You had a longer nose on it. You had a thinner tail. The tail was a little bit thinner, and we'll talk about that in a second. They added a second cooling intake underneath and put that bubble canopy on. The tail was a little bit larger because you need a little bit more room in the airstream. Now, they ran into a couple of challenges with these bigger engine airplanes. Greg, we talked about torque. We also talked about what else happens when you put one of these aircraft with this much power and speed. Do you know? Fred, fun fact, Aileron Reversal. What is that, Greg? Do you know what Aileron Reversal is? That means that you get up to the point in the airspeed where your controls actually reverse themselves. And when you're putting an input in the control surfaces on the airplane, you're actually getting the opposite result from the aircraft. And that was a problem with these airplanes. Now, these aircraft equipped mostly the what I would call the home guard units because they were very fast and they went after something. Greg, what did they go after? What? The V1, the buzz bomb, where the Germans had developed essentially, go out and look at what a V1 is. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I would call it the first kind of cruise missile. Very crude, had a gyro in it. It would fly a certain distance, had a big bomb in the front end, and it made this interesting noise. Greg can maybe pick that up and get a shot of one of those. And when it got over its target, where it was kind of predestined mechanically, remember we didn't have computers back then necessarily, the engine would cut out and it would just drop in and it would explode. We had that and the V2, which was actually the first kind of tactical rocket, but you couldn't, bombardment rocket, artillery, whatever you want to call it, they couldn't defend against that. But the V1s, they could. These airplanes would chase them. Now, they'd get these things up to power. These aircraft on takeoff and in the airstream would do what, Greg? They'd side slip. They'd almost fly sideways because you didn't have the fuselage was narrowed down. It was tapered, so the airplane would kind of side slip. And the pilots who took these off would talk about how the airplane almost took off sideways. You were getting so much torque. But this type of Spitfire was used heavily in the interdiction, and I'm going to pick this up because you can actually see this. This is, look, see the cannons. This is a Mark 14 going up, and what's he doing? He's doing a wingtip. What's a wingtip? A wingtip is they would come up and they would use the wing rather than shoot at this thing, because a fairly, so you can see, fairly small target. They would come up and they would tip the wing, and the V1 had a gyro in it that if you could tip it, it couldn't right itself. It didn't have like a traditional autopilot. It would just spin out of control and crash. So that, and the interesting, really, I always use interesting, Randy, Greg, very interesting. This, you can see, had the cannons. So this is configured like this airplane right here. That is so cool. Now, another, and we have a report here. We have a lot of really nice displays, either dioramas or things about the RAF. And this actually is the report on the buzz bomb, the V1, that you can learn about here. You can actually take a look at that. But the other, we've talked about a lot of these airplanes never left the continental United States, or they never saw combat. Greg, what's the difference about this airplane? What is it? You got to know. It's a combat veteran. It's one of the few combat veterans we have, this airplane actually brought down a V1. Is that amazing or what? Spitfire! Spitfire! There we go. The British guys in the house are excited. But this actually brought down a V1 buzz bomb. It is a combat veteran. So that's also something now interesting. Now, we're going to move on to my stage 2. And my stage 2 today is, as I drop my pencil, one of the things that we have some other English gentlemen who we have, and they have turned me on to, Greg, are you ready? Cucumber sandwiches. Cucumber sandwiches are really good. If you've never had one, find an English gentleman and have him figure out how to make you a cucumber sandwich. Now, I am going to open this up, and this is my stage 2. This is Mr. I love the play here, Mr. Cucumber. Q with a period, very clever. Sparkling cucumber beverage. It is all natural. This expires in January of 21, so this is another one of these long shelf life things. Now, Greg, you have not poisoned me in the last 3 outings, and I'm really thankful for that. I'm not sure whether Greg is bucking for more job security. He's trying to poison me with my stage 2, but we're going to give this a shot. Now, this is salute to all of the English pilots and the Commonwealth pilots and the American pilots that flew the Spitfire during World War II. You saved the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and you also showed what fortitude and determination can do against incredible odds. So with that, I'm going to try out my Mr. Cucumber. I must add, Mr. Cucumber is not a sponsor of today's program. I don't even know where you would find Mr. Cucumber. My Randy assistant Greg has been goes out and finds this stuff. I will say this: it has a distinct cucumber aroma, distinct, and I can't smell anything, and I could smell that. So here we go. You know what? Not bad, Greg. Not bad. I will continue to consume Mr. Cucumber, and as I go again. So to all of you out there that either made this airplane in Great Britain, flew them, maintained them, we salute you. God bless you. We always say that the English and Americans are a common people separated by language. As I demonstrated today, that is clearly true. And I've learned a great deal from my fine English chap. So this is an overview of the Spitfire. Now, if I could have my fine English gentleman join me in the shot one more time, we're going to tell you, remember, you go out to our website. Here he comes. He's strolling. All right, we need you to don your shirt here. There we go. You can own one of these. This will amaze your friends. You will be the talk of the party. Look, the English gentleman is telling you, go out to the website and pick one of these up. There's a glowing endorsement from a real Englishman, right? Yeah, true Englishman.
I'm English.
Yeah, there you go. And so thank you very much. I'm going to wrap it up. Remember, smash that subscribe button. Like us on Facebook. We're still fighting to get up to over 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. We're getting there. Also, go out to the website, pick up one of those. You can go to our gift shop, pick up one of those shirts, or give us a donation. My name is Fred Bell. I want to thank you for joining us on another edition of Warbird Wednesdays. Have a great day.